Okay, so uh, we have got the idea that is Alurista, uh, that poet is from Mexico, that his citizenship or nationality is American. And we have also learned that the Chicano people, they are from Mexico, and they are from a group or language family, and that name is Nahuatl or Nahua people. So they are derived from this tradition. So with that combination, we see that in the literature in post-colonial countries, the literature are getting mixture with several culture, with several tradition. Like that, okay. And in this regard, we see some other characters. That is here we see that means uh, Nicolas Goulain. Okay. Goulain is a Cuban national poet, and he was born and remembered as the national poet in Cuba. Born in uh, Camagüey, he studied law at the University of Havana, but abandoned a legal career and worked as both a typographer and journalist. Okay, so in such a way, we see some other important characteristics of in other uh, parts of this world, and we see that like uh, in 1930 decades, that is uh, like this writer, Cuban national poet Goulet, we see some other writer, Carpentier, we see some other writer, that is Amy Caesar, we see Fuentes and Mexican novelist. Okay, that is all are the character. We see some other writer in that categories. So that is his name is Alejo Carpentier. Most probably you have heard his name. He is influential writer, Latin American literature in his time, and he was born in Switzerland. And Carpenter grew up in Havana, Cuba. Despite his European birthplace, he strongly self-identified as Cuban throughout his life. So these are the writers we see in these categories. So Gulen and Carpenter wrote in Spanish, and 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 francophone, that means French speaking poet, Aimé Césaire drew like them upon African young rhyme rhythms, attempting to create a lost ancestral heritage. So these writers, as we have seen Aludista, Goulain, Carpentier, they are writing in English language. Simultaneously, they are writing in uh, Spanish language, but they inherit their culture. They inherit the culture of Spain. They inherit the culture of France, like that. And in the process of transforming a European language through the use of non-European rhythmical patterns. So they are writing in Spanish language. They are writing in French language, but the tradition, the culture they inherit from their mother country, not from the European countries. Okay. And uh, like other characters we see, that is Caesar's Africanness and the concept of negritude he espoused. Negritude as an assertion of the blackness and of the trump of the African spirit through the centuries of the oppression is in a new comparable to what Fuentes sees as an imposition of utopian ideals upon the new world by the first European. And Nadine Godimer argues that despite their desire to see themselves as a continuation of an African past. So we see some other writer. So they see this writer like Alejo Carpentier, Gulen, Amy Caesar, they carry their culture, and also the Fuentes, they carry their culture, and simultaneously they try to assert their own identity. That identity that they are not they are not no longer a part of the British colony. So they have their identity not from their culture, not from their language, but from their literature as well. What does it mean? It means that their literature created by Nadine Gordimer, literature created by Fuentes, literature created by Gulen, literature created by M. Caesar, Carpenter, this literature had their own identity, not like the literature of Europe. Okay? That is the identity of post-colonial literature in terms of comparative literature. Okay? So there is an excerpt that is given by the Caribbean writers. Okay? That Africa to the Caribbean writers was the color of their skin. And unlike the Jews, their identity had been fragmented in slave plantation instead of concentrated within the ghetto. But she also recognizes the impact of the dreams of Africa. Sorry, that has gone out of the screen. Okay, so always European people thought African people and the African and Caribbean people just uh, just like the uh, they have the identity of the slave plantation. They they didn't. European people thought that these people didn't have much identity. Their identity is quite similar to the slave plantation and like that. Okay, but we see that their literature is rich and their writers are getting so many writings important in terms of world literature. Okay, so that we see in their writings. And there had been a great deal of debate amongst African and Caribbean scholars about the ideological implications of negritude. Here we see Ole Soyinka recognize the importance of negritude in terms of its idealistic vision of Africa and African culture. Negritude movement is a movement to insert the identity of the Black Africans and the Black peoples. So Ole Soyinka said that negritude is itself a movement that will try to insert the identity of the Black people all over the world. So Ole Soyinka tried to exhibit such kind of notion in his writing. And you see that this Nigerian playwright, he he was awarded Nobel Prize in 1986. So in terms of negritude movement, Ole Soyinka said that it is a way of getting their identity in terms of culture and literature as well. And we see some other men in this category. His name is uh, uh, Sen Senghor, Cedar Senghor. Okay, he is a Senegalese poet. He also showed such kind of notions. Okay, so the European, African, Asian, Latin American literary system, they have their own identity. It is not like that the European literature will be the great literature, then other literature will be uh, less important. Okay, so every literature, every culture will have their own identity, and their literature is rich. And that literature, African literature, Asian literature, and Latin American literature are rich. That is proved by these great writers like this Nigerian poet and other writers. Okay, and so we see the comparatist is drawn into the labyrinth, for it offers an infinite wealth of altered perceptions and innovative connection. What is the labyrinth? Labyrinth, that comparatist, whenever we will be comparing literature of Europe and the other parts of the world. So how, in which way we will be calling European literature great? European literature always will be great. It doesn't mean. It means that other literature is also great. And for this reason, African literature, Asian and Latin American literature, they are creating something new in the in the perspective of literary phenomena. So that is important in case of post-colonial identities in comparative literature. Okay. So, but the labyrinth offers so many more possibilities. So comparatists ask the question, yeah, their literature is rich. So we have to focus on the literature that are produced in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So what it does not offer are clear-cut answers and definition. In this respect, the comparative labyrinth opened by post-colonial theories of literary production is much more in keeping with the pluralism of the modernist world of the 1990 decade and the positivist notion of the road along which culture marched towards progress ultimately leads nowhere. Okay, so cultural identity will go on and literature will go on. And literature is the production of culture. So the Chicano people, the African people, the Asian people, and the Latin American people, they will have their identity, they will have their culture, so they will have their literature as well. That is also very rich. So that is about uh, the literature in this area. We see after the negritude movement, we see another movement that is that comes in our discussion, that is Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And Marquez awarded Nobel Prize in 1982. So Marquez, 1986 most probably. Uh, so Marquez, as we have said, that Marquez comes up with his idea. He was awarded Nobel Prize for Literature, okay, in 1982. And his Nobel address, he tackled the question of the task of the Latin American writers, looking at the extraordinary history of his continent and from the first traveler's tales through the Pablo Neruda's, whose death came shortly after the coup which murdered the president of Chile in 1973, commenting upon the monstrous poverty and the continuous political oppression of the mass of the Latin America. He also refers to the dangers of seeking to interest these horrors from the European perspective, seeking Latin America as a underdeveloped without regard to the history of the atrocities in Europe and to the possibility responsibility of Europeans in forging the chain that binds other cultures. Okay, so Marquez, he comes up. He was awarded literature in 1982, and he said that actually the European atrocities in the colonial countries, actually that atrocities try to demean the culture of colonial countries all over the world, and in the Latin America it was not an exception. So the European colonial power suppressed and suppressed the culture of Latin America and the other parts of this world. And here we see Pablo Neruda, another writer of Chile. And Pablo Neruda was a Chilean poet, diplomat, and politician who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1971. So Pablo Neruda also said such kind of view. Okay. And apart from Pablo Neruda, we see another writer, Antonio Pigafetta. Okay. He was a Venetian scholar and explorer. He joined the expedition of the Spice Island led by the explorer. So we see such kind of scholars, they supported this idea. But Marquette, he said that actually the Latin American people, African people, they are black. Their culture are not rich. So the tradition of the black people established by the European people, Marcus said it is a myth. Actually, in reality, we see the opposite thing. What is the opposite thing? That the proof is that we see so many languages, so many cultures in Latin American and African continent. And if it is so that the myth that the black people, their culture is less important, that myth is not quite similar to the reality. And for this reason, Gabriel Garcia Marquez rejects such myth making. So this myth that the African people, Latin American people, their culture are less important, that myth is rejected by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And even whilst acknowledging that the reality of Latin America is just as the fantastical as the stories it generate. So Gabriel Garcia Marquez, actually he comes up with this idea of uh, magic realism that will come forward. But in his lecture, he said that this myth making cannot be accepted. However, we see a different fantastic culture in Latin America. Okay. And it is as fantastic as they produce stories, produce different kind of stories they produce. And the task of facing a Latin American writer is to find ways of talking about the reality. So the Latin American writer, what they are producing literature just to exhibit the reality of Latin American people. So the reality is opposite to the myth created by European people. European people. So we see another writer in this tradition, that is Faulkner. William Faulkner was an American writer and Nobel Prize literate from Oxford, Mississippi. And Faulkner wrote novels, short stories, screenplays, poetry, essays, and a play. Okay, so we see this important writer as well. Okay. So after that, we know that Gabriel Garcia Marquez is renowned for the ways in which he combines realism with fantasy. Okay, in his writing, 100 Years of Solitude, Gabriel Garcia Marquez combined fantasy with realism. Okay, so in what has come to be termed magical realism, and Carpentier had called it in a different way, that is the real in the marvelous. Borges has shown consistently how easily the boundaries between rational and anti-rational universes can be transgressed by a writer looking from a new perspective. So Gabriel Garcia Marquez, whenever he mixtured fantasy with realism, that came up with a new perspectives to watch the reality. বাস্তবতাকে যখন নিখাত বাস্তবতা দিয়ে প্রকাশ করা যাচ্ছে না, তখন গাব্রিয়েল গার্সিয়া মার্কেজ বাস্তবতা এবং ফ্যান্টাসি, কিছুটা ইমাজিনেশন, কিছুটা রিয়েলিটি, দুটোর মিক্সচারে যে জনরাটা বের করে আনলো, সেই জনরাকে বলছি আমরা ম্যাজিক রিয়েলিজম. So Borges claimed that Gabriel Garcia Marquez's magic realism is a new way to observe reality. বাস্তব জিনিসকে নতুন ভাবে দেখার যে প্রয়াস, সেটাই আমরা পেয়েছি গাব্রিয়েল গার্সিয়ার লেখার মধ্য দিয়ে. So that was also claimed by Borges and Carpentier. So with all this, we can't say that the Latin American literature, the literature of Gabriel Garcia Marquez and some other literature are not less important. They are important, not only important, they are there are something that we are going to look forward in a new perspectives, that is claimed by Borges and Carpentier in their writing. So Europeans were surprised at the universality of Boris. Octavia Paz says about Boris. That means Boris, the Europeans were surprised at the universality of Boris. And but none of them realized that this cosmopolitan was and could only be the point of view of Latin America. Okay, so Boris's writing style surprised European, and with that surprise, in case of comparative literature, that is a new way of looking at Latin American literature. Okay, and that is the post-colonial literature. So post-colonial literature can be and will be and has been an important part of world literature, and for this region that has been an important part or part of discussion in uh, comparative literature as well. So a comparative study of themes and images of exile as used by Chinese, European, Caribbean writers, for example, would produce some interesting diversities. So the people, the writer of post-colonial countries, the writer of Latin America, the writer of Chile, the writer of Senegal, the writer of African continent. So all the continent, the writer creates something new literature, and that gave literature a diverse phenomena. So literature before Gabriel Garcia Marquez, we didn't know about magic realism. Before Borges, we didn't know the real writing and aspects of poetry. Okay, so with that perspective, that is, we have got some diversified position of world literature, and that was created by post-colonial writers like Gulen, Carpentier, Faulkner, and some other writers. Okay, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Okay. Kavana points out quite rightly that the provincial perspectives is always looking elsewhere, seeing the center that is denied. Okay, so European people, they dominated the other parts of this world, and for this reason, they thought that Europe is the center. And what is the tendency? The tendency is that the peripheral region, that means the Africa, Latin America, Asia, and other parts will be looking towards centers. That means the Europe. But what happened for the production of so many rich literature by the writer of Latin American literature, African literature, Caribbean literature? They denied, that means the African writer, Latin American writer, they denied the European or utopian supremacy in terms of literature. Okay, that means it means that the Latin literature is also rich, the Caribbean literature is also rich, the Asian literature is also rich, the African literature is also rich. The whilst the provincial view turns inwards and in consequence become universal. So the Latin, African, Asian, they didn't look towards the center. Rather, they looked towards their own literature. And that has been universal in comparative literature. Okay. So he is Boris Argentine poet and storyteller essays. He played vital role in piece of writing literature. Okay, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez's magic realism, Borges' realistic poetry, and in such a way, the blending of cultures, however brutally begun, has produced the many different societies in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean today. And the evidence of the complex wave of the cultural threads is to be found in the literature of those regions. So the blending culture in Africa, Caribbean, and the Latin America, they produce literature, and their variety of culture we see in their writing, like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Borges, and some other writer in this area. Okay, and magic realism is an example. So in such a way, the post-colonial literature move forward. So the movement positions involves coming to terms with history. It involves finding a voice, naming things. It also involves showing the rest of the world what has happened along the way. And here we find the alongside narrative developments that can be loosely termed magical realist. Okay, so we see the juxtaposition of so many literary genre or literary perspectives. That is, apart from the European literature, we see the literature that were developed in the other parts of this world. That means Chicano from workers, peasant, urban slum dwellers, dislocated adolescent, reflecting on the states of the Chicano novel. Joseph Summers suggests that comparative cultural study might consider the work of a major novelist such as Thomas Rivera, alongside of that the other writers like Robert Musil, J.D. Salinger, Richard Wright, and Mario Vargas Llosa. Osa. The pronunciation is Osa, yeah, not Losa. Okay, to what? So, with the position of their culture in the different parts of this world, they produce literature, and their literature is rich as well, and they have their identity in such a way that is post-colonial comparative literature is also a voice of discovery. Okay, so we see that uh, in terms of comparative literature, if we compare, if we don't compare literature, one literature with another, what would be? That means rather we would accept, আমরা হয়তো স্বীকারই করে নিতাম যে ইউরোপিয়ান লিটারেচার গ্রেট, বাট যখন আমরা বিভিন্ন পোস্ট কলোনিয়াল পার্সপেক্টিভসে লিটারেচার গুলো আলোচনা করলাম, তখন আমরা দেখলাম যে অ্যাকচুয়ালি দ্য ল্যাটিন আমেরিকান লিটারেচার, the African literature, Asian literature, Caribbean literature, they are also rich. So the comparative journey towards the post-colonial literature is a new discovery in the world of literature. And by this only this time, instead of the European setting of in search of risk and new lands to inquire, equipped with maps and chats, and to aid him, this voice is one towards self-awareness. So, post-colonial literature in comparative perspectives is not only a voice of discovery, it is also a voice towards self-awareness, towards recognition. Self-awareness, that means the people living in Latin America, they were aware that yes, our literature and our culture is rich. It is towards the recognition, that means they will have their identity and the responsibility, guilt, complicity, and collision to the creation of the labyrinthine world of contemporary writer. Europeans are no longer embarking on the voyage from the center of the world either. So the European people living in their country, they will not be telling that we are the great, your literature is not great. So carve to barricade their voice of superior voice, the Latin American literature and the literature of other part created a new discovery. It created their own identity. It created their awareness in post-colonial, in comparative literature. So in such a way, the comparative literature and the comparative literature in post-colonial countries, that perspectives give us a new look to look towards the world literature. Okay, so that we have said. So we have said that in a nutshell, that is, in America we have seen Chicano literature. Apart from that, we have seen Latin American literature. Apart from that, we have seen Caribbean literature. We have seen the literature of Argentina. We have seen the literature of other parts. Before comparative literature study, we always observed that Europe was the center. They thought that their literature culture are rich, but we are getting so many important writers from these countries, and they are rich, and their literature is rich, and so the journey of comparative literature towards the post-colonial countries or post-colonial identities, that gave us a new outlook towards the literature of the world, and that would be a different phenomena in comparative literature. Thank you all. Okay, so